chosen.
I'm a little late to the party on this discussion, but you're here, so let me just say a few things. First of all, I'm not exactly an RE veteran. I spent my childhood playing Ratchet & Clank and my teens playing Metal Gear Solid. RE was never really high on my radar, so being newish to the series, I might not have the nostalgia factor going for me, which is a double-edged sword. I make no apologies for its failings, but also don't get to see the whole picture. Bear that last statement in mind when I go over my thoughts, but before I do me a favor and listen to this. There was once a special police unit that discovered a mansion. They then went on to inspire some good sequels until the creative team wanted to make new things. Around that time, the series started to drift away from horror and more towards action. This became the industry standard as horror was seen as a financial risk. Then some horror indie games cropped up and Hideo Kojima raised the roof with Silent Hills. Suddenly the mainstream audience was aching to play a horror game, and Capcom must have wised up at some point because they're promising to bring RE back to its survival horror roots, which may or may not be a good thing. Let's get deeper into this discussion and my thoughts on the demo, but first, let's weigh up the demo and see what it has going for it. Pacing is the distribution of content flow. There are numerous schools of theory and many research papers which talk about the perfect pace, but I'm of the school of thought that the ideal pace for any given project is exclusive to that project. Some things should be slow, other things should be fast, etc. The good thing about the pacing in the demo is that it seems to be a natural evolution of the replay system in older games, where finishing a campaign with one character would alter the campaign for the other character. The demo does this by breaking the pacing up and presenting the player with events happening in a larger timeline to play in. The bad news is, however, that this is very scripted in the demo and hopefully that is not indicative of the final product. Because I love the idea of being filled into my surroundings via flashbacks and having to locate objects in many timelines. This also might give us some environmental storytelling, as the present environment might have some different elements than the past environments. The pacing of the actual narrative, however, is nothing to write home about, but it isn't really bad either. It gets the player moving and lets them know the stakes, so it does its job, but it seems to me like there's some wasted potential in the structure of the pacing. The demo seems very reliant on scripted events for progression, which has often been floated as the only solution to pacing a video game right, but it completely ignores the player and their role in the story. Players and pacing actually very rarely mix, and some devs have discussed a 50-50 system, where the game offers the player the choice to make a move and the player should do his part. That system makes it so that when the player is just dicking around, they aren't playing right, but this line of thinking is very limiting, I think, and I feel an improved system for delivering narrative in this line of thinking would be Space Invaders, where the content is always arriving and the player has no choice in stopping to smell the roses and break the pace because they're always being stimulated. Not a perfect solution, no, but not worse than the 50-50 system. Anyway, this is a medium-wide problem, so why am I picking on the RE7 demo? Well, it's because the older RE games have a player-controlled pacing mechanic built into them, and it's a shame that the system is not recreated. The system I'm talking about is, of course, the combat encounters. Each enemy was located where it needed to be to get the player moving in a certain direction, and the only reason we don't remember the old games as being heavily scripted is because we didn't lose any of our controls over our progression or our input capabilities when the enemies arrived. Not only did this system succeed in creating tension, but it also has quiet time intrinsically built in. But come on, surely that only worked because of the fixed camera and tank controls, right? Wrong. RE7 is played from a first-person perspective, and what many don't realize is that in good hands, there can be very little difference from first-person perspective and traditional tank controls. Both of them make combat clunky and are a good format for environmental storytelling. Both make combat more a question of positioning, which creates an environmental dependency, which is good for immersion. Both limit vision, even though RE7 on VR might not be falling into that trope, and neither are very elegant when mapped onto the conventional controller. The biggest difference in the perspective shift from third person to first person is that the player no longer views this as Leon's story, or Jill's story, or Chris's story, but rather as their own story, and that isn't a setback in any way. I think the aspirations of the systems of RE are a much more integral part of the series to nail than the characters of RE. So, as long as its play invokes the feeling of the old RE games, this shouldn't be as jarring a transition as some make it out to be. Another thing that gets lost when moving from traditional tank controls over to first-person perspective is cinematography, but since this is a VR game, I think the devs will find some other interesting ways to play around with our field of view. And even though I really like the visual aspects of the traditional tank controls, there's more to the horror than camera movement. Speaking of which, RE is synonymous with zombies, and as much as I wanted to talk about the history of zombies in pop culture, I just couldn't fit it in, because RE doesn't really use zombies for anything more than tension building. Let me explain. The great zombie stories are about the humans' reaction to the zombies. They deal with the collapse of society, the degradation of sympathy, and the isolation of living, but RE uses zombies to give the player something to fight. And by making combat clunky, ammo scarce, and save points distanced, they create a horror system where the player is never in an optimal position for engaging the enemy. This is a system that can work without zombies, so I couldn't really talk about their pop culture footprint, but rather got to talk a little bit about RE's presentation of zombies. Keep in mind, this isn't bad or a critique. I'm not saying to ditch them, just making an observation. The horror system also works in a first-person perspective, but personally, I don't think that's the right way to go. I think it would be a welcome return to form, and a bold step in which to retake the series, but I think the better thing to do would be to completely redesign the system and make us rethink what survival horror can be. Implementing emotions of desperation and survival guilt into the mechanics, just to name a few, would be interesting, and it would also give the narrative something to latch onto from a mechanical standpoint. I know better now than to suggest on how to design games, so I'll leave the speculation up to you in the comments if you want. Back on zombies. The family whose house we entered is using the horror angle of degradation. Everything in the house is dilapidated, even the people, and that's something that zombie stories often use. The degradation narrative often focuses on how consumption has outweighed production, which leads to desperation in people and a social loss of sympathy. But the demo uses some of those tropes to deliver a kind of true detective backwater degenerate enemy in the evil resident. I don't know if that will be implemented in the mechanics, but the game's option menu offers aim assist, so I assume that there will be some kind of gun combat, and I doubt it will look like this. But rather, I think we're looking at a game that offers a limited resources-focused combat, which can be interpreted as a mechanical representation of consumption outweighing the production. An interesting thing about the limited resources actually is how it alters the player's mindset regarding space. As mentioned earlier, when the players are mechanically dependent on their environment, they automatically become more immersed in the game space. Rummaging in drawers for bullets and waiting for the perfectly lined up shot to save said bullets are also tense moments that can make for some interesting horror. So as I promised, a discussion on bringing RE back to survival horror and my thoughts on the demo. I don't think this will be a return to survival horror. We've all seen a lot of companies make that promise before, but it seems the industry no longer understands what that means, so I'll spell it out. Survival horror is any system that makes interacting with it a question of life and death. The system is designed to create unease and desperation. That system works really well when the player is underpowered against overpowered enemies. To balance that game, enemies should be made slower and combat should be position-based to immerse the player. This is what RE did really well for a while. But seeing as Capcom isn't willing to fully commit to traditional tank controls yet, I think a good idea would be to completely redesign the system and redefine how these games should be played. Which is a large undertaking, I know, but let's not forget that RE did it before. Twice, actually. Now, final thoughts on the demo. All in all, I think it bodes really well for RE7. It has glimpses of old-school survival horror embedded into its systems and seems to have enough of an identity to stand out. I think come VR, we're going to see the real potential of the game, and even though this demo might not be very indicative of the final product, I at least like where it's going a lot more than from where it's coming.